could be at home
Well, yes, that's true.
with the baby who's a year old.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, it typically works.
Doesn't seem to wanna.
I don't think I've ever seen anybody try to use it from over there, though.
Well, do it. See, it doesn't really wanna do anything.
Oh, great. Brian, what's your thought? Usually the mouse
It's working, but
yeah, but I mean, it usually,
So, did we have a kids tour come through here or something? Lights all broken over here.
it's not doing anything. Weird. The mouse isn't working. Oh, wait. Well, it's flashing. Should be all set to go.
well, I mean, it's moving around, but the arrow is gone. Just try to. Not sure why that is. And I don't know. Just fixed it.
Okay. And I didn't touch anything here, so it was something you did, for sure.
Okay.
All right. Did anyone?
I am. Is someone going to be to the left of you? Because I do think there's a distance issue with this mouse.
Alderman Moriarty should be here.
Yeah. I'm just.
Do you want to try this seat here, or even like right next to Tom?
Yeah.
This was working yesterday.
Right here, Brian.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was saying right there. It's even closer.
I don't know if Alderman Moriarty's going to be here. That's why I was just looking to see if I had. Oh, here right now. 1 second. Hi.
Hi, Mary Ann.
Hi.
I'm parking right now. I'll be right up the stairs.
Okay. See you in a second. Thanks. Bye. He's on his way up the stairs.
Sue says the audio is coming through.
Oh,
I
wonderful.
think we're on.
We're on. We have someone new running the show back here. George, if you would want me to hand. How was traffic coming down? George, how was
Yes.
your traffic coming down?
Not bad at all.
Good.
People are in a hurry,
Yes.
so I just went right along with it.
Yeah. Unless you're on the shoulder, it's impossible to go the speed limit.
Right.
Gone, she says. It's up in the closet at the top of the stairs.
to Somerville very often, but I did go to a place called Dolly, which was a tapas.
Yes, yep, right in
Place
the
that
corner of Highland.
Yeah,
And,
it's kind of, you kind of come in at an angle.
yes, you do.
So, pretty cool. Interesting interior, lots of dark, like reds and,
Yeah, it's neat.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very nice. I like that place. We were talking too, I was just having a conversation with someone over lunch today. We were up in Concord, and went to a burger place on the way back. And we thought, Nashua could really do well with
Okay.
a burger place on Main Street, like
we have-
Bartley's, down in Harbor Square.
I'm going to call to order a meeting of the Planning and Economic Development Committee on Tuesday, October 17th at 7:06 PM in the Aldermanic Chamber. And if the clerk would call the roll, please.
Alderwoman Marianne Litzigolia.
Present.
Alderman Orge Dan Moriarty is here. Alderman Orge Brian McCarthy.
Present.
Alderman Tom Lopez.
Here.
Alderman Ben Clemens is not here.
Not here. I've not heard from him. Has anyone else heard from Alderman Clemens? No? Okay, just
I think he may
He's
have
off.
mentioned last night that he might not be able to make it tonight.
Okay, thank you. And also in attendance, we have Alderman Shoneman, and we are joined by George Reagan from the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, who will be presenting with us. Public comment? None? And so, George, if you would like to begin. Everyone has a copy of the slides as well as a one-page front and back that Mr. Reagan's going to be referring to. And so welcome. I had asked Mr. Reagan to join us this evening to talk about workforce housing and how it supports economic development in a community. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here, and in trying to prepare for this, I thought it might be good to have a good variety and range of information about the connection of housing and economic development. So when I originally thought of having just a few slides, it kind of morphed into more as we look at housing cost and availability and rental, and it's important to be able to give you that information, although I'll try not to dwell on it and turn it into sort of an economics lecture. That's certainly not where my perspective is. I'm the Housing Awareness Program Administrator for New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. And so again, it's a pleasure to be here tonight and be able to talk to you about housing, our role in trying to help provide housing and its connection to economic development. But just first, I just thought I'd just talk a little bit about who we are. In case you don't know, New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority was established in 1981 as a public benefit corporation. We're self-funded. We're not a state agency or a department of the state. But we are an instrumentality of the state, so the state doesn't have its own housing department. So we handle all of those matters, the HUD funds that come through, other federal funds, the tax credit program. And so we are looked to as that agency to take care of that. So that's just a bit about how we started. One of our goals, as you see up there, is to provide leadership and research and public education. We do a lot of education and advocacy. We work with regional workforce housing coalitions. There used to be one in Nashua. It was a program of the United Way. And the whole purpose of that is to look at how do we look at housing not just from a social issue, but from an economic development issue that impacts us all. So that is one of our goals. I know that for us, we very much are looking at how does the market respond and how do we help to guide the market and developers into building things we think that our communities want, and that's municipality by municipality. So that's just a bit about it. We talk a lot about the balanced, the connection of a balanced and adequate housing supply and that relationship to economic development. So wanted to let you know that. A couple of things we do, we have a home ownership program. We used to have just a first-time home ownership program, but we've got programs for, lots of specialty programs for folks with disabilities, veterans, but also just programs for low and moderate income individuals. So there's certain programs, and we do this through lenders throughout the state to help people have successful home ownership. We also administer the Housing Choice Voucher Program, tenant-based vouchers to help people afford their rent. We have about 3,500 vouchers, is a little over 9,000 in the state administered by other organizations. Rental housing program, we administer the low-income housing tax credit program, which is a program in the U.S. Treasury. And that's been very successful, certainly a number of developments here in Nashua over the years. Cotton Mill is an example of one that was a mixed income development targeted to tax credit, and then some that were market rate. And then in where I am, lots of research and advocacy. We gather a lot of housing data. We get and do an annual rent survey that's provided, that lots of information is helpful to communities, regional planning commissions, and the like. And a lot of that information, if you've not been to our website, nhhfa.org, is available there. So lots of information about housing, economic data, and the like. Okay, so to sort of get into what I was asked to talk about, as I said, for us, we've seen the affordability of housing as very instrumental in sort of economic development. For those that know Russ Tebow, he owns Applied Economic Research. A lot of communities have, and so have we, employed his expertise and knowledge to be sort of a professional consultant and person who helps to delve into situations and issues to help provide some light on them. We've used him a few times for looking at school enrollment and housing. But one of the things Russ said a couple of years ago, and that's his quote, is labor force availability is the constraint on economic growth, and housing is that constraint on labor force growth. So it's interconnected. As businesses grow, they're looking for a labor force, and as we need more of our labor force, there's got to be a place for them to be living close by. And so the question, though, is what comes first? Is it the business that locates to the area and grows here, or is it the workforce? And I think, and if you've had relationships and talked with your employers, a lot of them are saying we're looking for a skilled and ready workforce that can be here, be ready to be employed. So when you think about it that way, then we look at how do we arrange our housing or provide through land use regulations and the like, housing that can respond to those market forces, so we're making sure that there's enough supply for the demand of a growing workforce. And of course, housing cost and availability, and also choice. As we know, people have a choice in where they want to live, and they've got some housing needs and preferences. So it's important that we sort of take that in consideration as well. And that's what I end up talking with when I talk with communities about the workforce, the people they're concerned about, and what are folks' housing needs and desires. So first off, when you take a look at that, then we were talking about what is workforce housing. Well, certainly it's housing for the region's economy. I went on to New Hampshire Community Profiles, and you've probably seen this. This is some of your largest Nashua businesses, from BAE Systems, over 3,000, to the post office. And as you look in there, you can sort of tell, you see a school district, a hospital, that those employers are providing high-end wages and low-end wages. And so when we think about that, when we look about workforce housing, we're really talking about a range of incomes, and that it's a regional economy. I looked at neighbor next door, Merrimack businesses. Folks aren't just living and working in Nashua. We're living regionally, and we're working in a regional economy. And so this tells me sort of when we're concerned about housing and what we're allowing to be built, who is this workforce? And these companies represent just some of what is going on in this Nashua region. Certainly what we don't see up there are the entrepreneur community, other small businesses that are here employing people, professionals, lawyers starting out, commercial lenders and the like starting out. And I bring that out just as we sort of think about this, as to think about what is our housing, what are we trying to think about in terms of housing for the employers here and the people that work for them. And so those wages, though, turn themselves into household income. And so one of the series of data that I wanted to be able to show you is households by household income. So this is the city of Nashua. And so when we look at those employers regionally and the range of what they're paying, this is sort of the stratification of it. And we see family households in that sort of purple or magenta, and then non-family in green. So family is what you would think. Two or more people that are related, so maybe a husband and wife, couple, maybe a child, something like that. The non-family could be a lot of different things. Single people that are both old and young, unrelated folks that maybe just graduated from college or started out in their early careers, and so they're living. And so that median, that middle income, when you look at family and non-family, sort of shows you a range of incomes right here in the city of Nashua. And so when you look at that and that family median income of 40,000, if you look at that from affordability perspective, again, going back to what's workforce housing, that income, if they spend no more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities, they can afford about a monthly rent of a little over $1,000 a month. So on the family side, again, two or four more related individuals, family median income there is 81,156. So they're in a little bit different position in terms of the rental side, and then certainly on the purchase side. So when you think about their affordability of principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, what might they be able to afford? And that may be a home approximately around $270,000, again, with no more than 30% of your income. And I think one of the challenges here too is that if we homeowners, we entered into the housing market in a myriad of different ways and different times. And so when we fix our housing costs, it may seem interesting, about affordability of a home for $270,000 or an income. And I think the other thing to think about is it starts getting us thinking about the profiles of people. And as I talked about younger folks, we have to remember that they come out of college maybe different than we did, with higher debt loads. Certainly in here, even though this is more of an urban community, the need for car is certainly pretty high. And so there's these economic issues that affect folks that are in that workforce in terms of what they need to make in terms of not just their living, but their transportation and other things. So that's just something to think about. I just wanted to cut it a different way. There's owner-occupied housing units, so people that are living in homes that they own, and then renter-occupied. And the incomes are kind of similar. It's the renter side is about half the income of the ownership side. And when we think then about renter median income, and then about them trying to move on and maybe stay longer term in a community and their housing options, it's not just what that housing cost goes for, but how they're able to save up money for a down payment. We have some pretty good programs at New Hampshire Housing, but still there's that need to be able to pay down debt, college debt in a lot of cases, and also afford monthly principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So it takes a while, and so if rents are higher, that delays the ability for folks to get into their homes. So just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the purchase price side of things here in the Nashua region. This is the Nashua labor market area, so it includes not just Nashua, but Londonderry, Merrimack, as well, and a few other areas. If you look at that chart, the green is all homes, the blue is existing homes, and then that purple again are new homes. And what this certainly shows is our trend of home ownership or home costs has been trending upward. And certainly on the new home side, new homes that are built and sold tend to be far greater in terms of cost than existing homes that we have. So that's that. And then in terms of the city of Nashua, when we look at the frequency of home sales, looking again at new homes there, not a lot of them. In fact, the data that we had was about 11 homes in the last year, so there's not a lot being built. And then some of those, maybe at the lower end, could very likely be condominium sales. And that's for the city. Yes.
Can I infer from that last slide, because the green and blue bars were so close together, that the number of sales of existing homes far exceeds the number of sales of new homes?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. And that's a good question. I don't have the exact number of units sold, but as I said, with the new homes, it's about 11, 12, 15 homes. It's not a lot. So moving on, just wanted to look at some Nashua data. This is MLS listings. And as you can see that that's been a trend upward, and this is pretty similar throughout the state. And that trend has gone up. The median sale price for all homes, as you see on that chart, is upwards of about $291,450. And so that includes both new homes that were just built and also existing. So to kind of look at some of that data, if you were to look at trying to, again, afford a house for sale at that range, we're looking at around between $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 when you look at trying to make sure your housing costs are no more than 30%. The thing that's important to note as we look at those home sales is why do they keep going up? Well, there is demand for purchase housing, but the other is that we just have fewer listings. There's less homes on the market. And so that is driving up the cost as well. So the supply of homes is decreased. Moving on to the rental side, the city of Nashua, this is our annual rent survey once again. So we look at that trend line and we see that rent for a 2-bedroom is up to about $1,559 a month. That's gross rent and utilities. And that is the red line. The blue line is all units. So 1 bedroom, 3, 4 bedrooms is $1,359. And so a thing to point out that all during a recession, rents never did ever go down in almost any place, except perhaps up in Coos County. And so there's always been push, and some of that early on was that there was a lot of folks displaced from homes through high foreclosure. And those folks are still in some of those rental units waiting for their credit to become better and to looking for what's available on the market for them to buy. So there's a lot of competition for rental units by people that weren't maybe in them historically, but through job loss or divorce and dealing with the home, had to move into rental. The other striking element here is that essentially the vacancy rate is less than 1% in Nashua. And that's not far off from where things are throughout the state, which is about 1.4 and 1.7. So that's what we kind of call turnover. That's someone leaving an apartment and David, as you know, sort of painting the walls and things and just getting another tenant in. So, we've got folks that are looking to find rental units, and essentially with that low vacancy rate, that's driving the cost of rental units up. Even though, in the city of Nashua, there's been a lot of rental housing production. And not all of it's been tax credit, some of the market rate. And so there's a lot going on, but this is indicative of just the growing demand. And that probably gets back to our economic development and growth that we're trying to wrestle with here as this particular group. So what does that mean? So that kind of puts us into this economic dilemma, right, of seeing that I didn't talk about the unemployment rate, but I think we know it's low. It's, I think, 2.7 was what I saw for August. And so, going back to the profile of employers we talked about and thinking about entrepreneurs, so lots of small businesses that are really the backbone of the state. Also, the fact that we've got an aging population, so we've got older folks that are downsizing, competing for a lot of similar small homes or even rental units that younger folks are looking for. People starting early out in their career, and that's important to note as we look at the economy and the housing economics of housing as well. To kind of conclude with the Russ Tebow study, this was again, we do a lot of research and keep close with what's going on with housing. We commissioned a study with Russ back in the late 90s looking at a similar issue. We had economic growth in the 90s. We had a lot of homes that were left from an oversupply of building. And when we came out of that, we realized that there wasn't much housing production, and what was being built were really high-end homes that certainly fit a niche. But when we looked at the overall employment base, it wasn't meeting that. We gained a lot of our labor force from in-migration. And as housing prices got higher and affordability became more difficult, then we kind of lost that influx of a labor force, and that contributed to our economic slowdown. And so as Russ puts here as major finding of his analysis regarding housing policy, that has a structuring influence over the state's economic development. And that happens municipality by municipality. And so that is sort of the dilemma, but tries to put together, what's housing, what's workforce housing, and there's a definition from a workforce housing law, and I put that out there. There's HUD income numbers about, for purchase, 100% of the area median income for a family of four, paying no more than 30% of that income on housing gets a certain affordability. And it becomes a maximum that you can look at. It becomes a guide, I like to think, in terms of what a community can look at. I think what's more telling, the same thing on the renter side, is a 60% of the area median income for a family of three. And again, it doesn't mean that that's the only numbers of people that can live in a home, but it gives us to what are those incomes and what does that equate to affordability? And it's helpful in your discussion to think about what people are affording and tying it back to the regional economy and not just an abstract number. It's what your employers are paying, but certainly that's a middle point, and we have to think it's easier for folks that are making higher income. In fact, we don't even have to probably think, if you're making $90,000 and $100,000 a year, maybe 30% of your income on housing isn't as big a deal as when you're making 30 and 40 and 50. And so that has a greater impact as we think about rental affordability, starter homes, and the like. And that sort of gets back to, this dilemma. And with a low unemployment rate, where do we get that workforce? We're probably competing with one another in terms of employers here, but also trying to compete nationally and maybe even globally. And a lot of times, what folks are looking at here as they come to New Hampshire is job offer, quality of life certainly, but housing that may be far different in terms of cost than they've ever been used to, just because of where they may live. So that's sort of where I wanted to end this, to kind of, again, say that our work and the work we do with communities is trying to help understand the sort of profiles of folks that are looking for homes, the range of incomes that come out of just the range of employers, employment types, and just looking at, if we're trying to look at affordability, trying to get to some range of numbers in terms of rental and housing, and then getting to, well, how do we try to guide that in a way that is respectful of municipal budgets, of developers, and how they develop, and certainly the economics of development itself. There's a lot more of I think, influencers on that. We have transit-oriented development. We were talking about that in Somersville in Massachusetts, or Somerville. That tends to increase property values because of transportation. So all those things are factors as we look to try to guide our development in ways that can be affordable and meet a range of people's needs and wants in terms of housing. And with that, certainly if there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to.
Alderman McCarthy.
Yeah, I actually have a number of questions. I wanted to go back to the comment you made about foreclosures and people who are renting, waiting for credit. It seems to me that the number of foreclosures we must have had during the recession was fairly small, because had we had a large number of them, that would actually show up in the housing inventory when they were turned over. And we never saw any influx of additional housing, through, I mean, your graph there shows that the inventory stays
Right.
pretty low. So
Yep.
it would seem like the number of foreclosures is fairly small.
Number of foreclosures was very high in the state for a number of years. I kind of skipped over foreclosure data, so I may not have anything to, but pre-recession, it went from hundreds, maybe a year, to thousands a year. I can't follow through what happened. Investors picked up those homes. And in fact, next to me in Dover is an investor-owned home that was once a single-family homeowner that got foreclosed upon. So that's
you
one
think
thing.
that may have resulted in changes from owner-occupied housing to rental housing, basically?
Yeah, right. And so that, I mean, not good for the homeowner that got foreclosed upon, but it worked for an investor in terms of renting. And interestingly enough, the person who first rented that was a planner in the city of Dover, and I discovered he was my neighbor because I became the member of the zoning board of adjustment. So he said he literally lived next door to drop my package off. So I was confused by what he meant by that. And so, but he looked at, and he had a young family. He's doing pretty well as a planner. But was concerned about the stability of the housing market, maybe even the stability of our own incomes back then. But anyway, yeah, so investors bought that, but we wouldn't say that was all that happened. A lot of homes stayed unforeclosed because the banking industry didn't really want to, had to deal with what does that mean in terms of valuation of that property. But thankfully that has gone down significantly in the last couple of years, but it did hit the high point of, I think we're talking about thousands every year.
Do we know whether that's uniformly distributed across the state, or is that?
Well, because there's more housing in the southern region, there was more foreclosures. So we certainly saw a whole lot more there, but it impacted every aspect of the state.
Alderman McCarthy.
And it sort of seems to me that one of the the basic constraint on housing in Nashua is land cost.
Yeah.
That, we've had a splurge of $500,000 plus homes built over the last 10 years on a third to half acre lots. And basically that creates a finished lot cost of land that's well over $100,000 an acre. It's tough to amortize that on a moderate number of rental units. So it would seem that if we actually want to do anything about that, what we really have to do is allow for much greater density of rental units per acre
Right.
than is currently sustained by
Yeah.
most of our zoning.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think density is certainly an area, and Nashua I think seems to offer some pretty good density already. But we've got again, going back to vacancy rates and just availability of homes for sale, that there's a real demand for it. So new units that come online in the rental, even with high density, are probably going to go near the top of a market, whatever that may be. I've heard of rents here for really nice, properties for rent for 2,000, 3,000 and more. And so density would be something to look at. Another thing that might be good to look at that I'm not sure is being employed here would be incentive-based zoning, so inclusionary zoning that may say, take a look at the economics of development and look at the demand for development, so that, and look at what might be the ratio if we give a developer additional density, more units to build, maybe another story, let's say, that in exchange for that, a certain percentage of those units would be targeted at some kind of an affordability. So again, there's a workforce housing law that's a guide. Some of the incomes that I've shown in terms of the renter side put renter household income at around 40,000 or something. So what is that number? And can we try to work an equation that gives some kind of density, but also with that density, we don't just give it away, we guide a developer into maybe building something. In New Hampshire, inclusionary zoning is a voluntary inducement. It can't be mandatory. Massachusetts has a 40B. New Hampshire's workforce housing law is not set up that way. It's set up to give municipalities maximum, flexibility and how to address it. But that could be something to look at, given the development is strong. And then looking at economies. In the single family side, it is more difficult given cost of land to maybe do 4 or 5 units and have some of them be targeted. And so it may be looking at where are areas where single family production still can sort of happen, single family detached, and their developer has maybe some opportunity for some kind of economies of scale.
So I guess I'm looking at projects like the Renaissance development over by the river.
Yeah.
I've actually seen a lot of the stuff in there through my involvement with the BIDA. And I mean, if I look at that project, their pro forma comes out with a rent number that's fairly high to sustain it. They've about maxed out the density that they can build with wood frame construction. They've done four-story pedestal development.
Yeah.
And so you can't knock a lot out of the construction cost. You might be able to go with lower cost finishes. So
Right.
I don't see a number you can tweak out of that in our current economy that gets the rent down in the final product.
Yeah, and that could be true. I think it's something that would just be good. Have you been able to look at it, beginning to end? What's the all-in costs? Certainly land costs, labor, materials cost are big numbers, but what ends up being costs in terms of costs for approval, other fees that are paid, the timing of approval process, not knowing how long that takes. Are things, can you do this by right? Is there flexibility in the planning board, or does that have to go through ZBA? Which may all, add up to maybe provide more barriers than incentive to a developer. But I think that's a good point, and I think that's what I would just want to explore. Thinking of that, or even other developments, could the developer have done some and still have a pretty decent ROI such that they still would have done it? And that ends up being the other part is, so a conversation with a developer about the economics of development on their end, and then taking a look at, the combined land use regulations, approval processes and all of that, and are there things that can be done? In some other places, we look at, and certainly when we looked at affordability, two big things that came up, aside from density, were road frontage requirements and road standards. And I don't know how that plays out here, what those impacts are, but there are places where road standards literally just make it just economically unviable to do almost anything but market rate. And you've got that balance of, well, we want good roads, we don't want bad roads, we have to tear up and fix, but we have to combine those things with what happens if we truly are concerned about a really low vacancy rate, and what comes on the market is high end, and we understand economics of supply and demand, but with such sort of a dearth of housing that it takes a while for that to really trickle down.
We actually narrowed the road standard for suburban developments a few years back from, we used to require 28 or 30 feet of pavement, and we now will allow
Yeah.
24. But the right-of-way development is still expensive because of, water, sewer, sidewalks, power, et cetera. But another thing that we've done in a couple of places is to allow allow lot dimensions that were not necessarily derived directly from the density. So we platted a 300 parcel property on 300 acres, but the lot sizes are actually around a quarter acre, and there's a large amount of open space, which dramatically reduced the frontage requirements and
Right.
therefore the road cost. I think that's one of the things that I actually like doing that because we don't have to plow as much, we don't have to pave as much.
Right.
The developer doesn't have to build as much, and there's a lot more open space that way.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that sort of seems like cluster development to me, but you're right. And then you just look at, especially where you're trying to kind of protect open space, that you can have that, and with good planning, good design, that can look good. You're right. Use less roads, cost less, and maybe again in that development, can some percentage of them maybe be targeted? And again, knowing the economics, never going to probably be 100% or anywhere close, but some percentage, 10, 20%, who knows?
Anything else?
I think that's it.
Alderman Moriarty.
Thank you, Chairman. I like the presentation. I like the data. I like the plots. I was looking at some of them, and so regarding the whole purpose or the essence behind workforce housing laws, a couple things in the law bother me. The statement, all municipalities must provide reasonable and realistic opportunities for the development of workforce housing. And then further down, existing housing stock shall be accounted for to determine if the municipality is providing its, quote, fair share of current and reasonably foreseeable. The idea of just trying to fair share and municipalities have to do this and do that, it just goes against my nature as sort of liberty and freedom, let the free market do this. But with that aside, so let me ask you a couple of questions. the developers, in my opinion, should be free to develop whatever property they would like if they own the property, and as long as it meets code. If they want to make it expensive in order to develop it, I mean, if somebody's going to invest money, take their own capital and build a building, and they have every right to turn a profit. And if they want to maximize the profit, more power to them.
Right.
So if I were them, what I would do is look at this. You have this great plot here that has renter incomes are about half of owner incomes. And what I like about it is it has the histogram of, based on the salary range, how many of those type of people are there, how many families have a certain income.
Right.
And then we have on the next page, the city of Nashua home sales frequency, and it shows the cost of the houses and how many of those houses have been sold. It'd be cool to see if we really had not just the city of home sales frequency, but the existing home values, and compare existing home value histogram with the income value histogram, and look at rental costs, how many rental units are cheap and how many are moderate and how many are expensive, and compare that to people who rent, how much have low income, medium, and you could compare those and see where there's a gap and see, then you could deduce from that where you might be in the market would naturally encourage a developer to build a housing of a certain type because he's going to get rented, assuming that they can do that investment and make the return on investment like Alderman McCarthy was talking about earlier. At some point you can't just, a developer's not going to invest a lot of money on rental units that don't turn a profit. It doesn't make
Right.
sense.
Yep.
Then combine all that with I have a hypothesis that if you produce a lot of housing, if a lot of housing becomes available, even if that's at high cost, it's going to relax pressure and all the other rents will drop. And so you will end up creating affordable housing just by virtue of creating housing, period. So if you want to create affordable housing, you don't necessarily have to build affordable housing. You can build expensive housing because everything else, the competition will relax. So given I've already sort of biased it that I feel that the market could take care of itself. I feel that the developers should be allowed to make a profit, to maximize their profit, and that they would be the ones that should make this analysis. So I don't know if there's a question, why aren't they building more rental units? Why aren't they building more housing units? And what can the city do to encourage people to just build more housing, period, and more rental units, period?
So there's a lot in there to unpack. And so I would agree with you about the simple laws of supply and demand. The other piece of that is the function of time. And so right now you've got a less than 1% vacancy rate on the rental side of the market. You've got concern, I'm hearing, of employers that are trying to recruit and retain a workforce, and those incomes aren't necessarily at your 1,000, to be able to support $1,300, dollars a month rent, let's say. So I don't disagree. I mean, I think that over time, if perhaps you can do that, I don't know what other factors may come into play. And so I think as communities have looked at that, they've looked at I think how you ended. What do we do to try to incentivize development? And so that's the one thing about supply and demand that I had to take microeconomics twice, so that's as far as I'm going to go with supply and demand. But the other piece, I think, I couldn't agree more that developers, this isn't about having them, take a loss to build something. But you did also mention that, you think the free market should take care of it, and I would sort of submit that some of our land use regulations constrict that free market. And so if a homeowner, and some people in communities are leaving their communities, they can't afford to live there, and sometimes that's because they can't subdivide their 3-acre lot. And now maybe there's some reason for that. Maybe they don't have infrastructure, although there's ways of doing that as well. And so I think it's important, and this gets back to what a community wants. Do you want to go with that as a function of time, or are there other things that compel us to think about how much time we have and what those things we should maybe look at to just make sure we're trying to help address it. Like I said at the beginning, there's been a lot of rental housing that's been built that's developers have done. The answer, why aren't they building it? It's a good question for a developer. I would ask a lot of some of the great developers you have down here. I know Dick Anagnos is never short on words to talk about, the things that he requires for development. And I think a lot of times it's about predictability, time of approval process, things like that, and then the economics of it. And I think a question to him might provide some really interesting results that might give you an answer of, maybe if we change this or that, a guy like him or other developers may build something, and some of those may be targeted. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish, and that's why part of the incomes I provided in the outset is sort of like who you're trying to help, because it's easier for folks that are making higher income. It's a little bit more difficult for those that aren't. And what's coming on the market are things that are higher rent, and the new home sales are higher. I think the home value idea that you look at is a good one, because I think it's important for a community to look at and say, what are our home values? But those are homes that are already here, and if we're at a low unemployment rate, we need more housing for people to come into. And what we're seeing for new is kind of higher end, 300,000. So I think we just look at that, but I think those are great questions to kind of unpack and explore. And just a final thing about the workforce housing law, the thing that I think is unfortunate about how it comes across is this notion about reasonable and realistic and then fair share, because they're two very different things. If a community, through its land use regulations and looking at some of the aspects of the law, again, in the Nashua area, I think a home that would be considered workforce housing on the purchase side would be $315,000, and then rent would be about $1,270. It's looking at, are the sum total of your land use regulations allowing reasonable and realistic opportunities for that to be built? It doesn't say that you got to build 100 of them, 1,000 of them, or whatever. It's just, can a developer come in and actually do it? And maybe they choose not to. So the interesting thing about the law is that a lot of people, you could say, yeah, your inclusionary zoning is great. I just don't want to do it. I want to do something else. And you'd actually meet the spirit of the law. But I think I'm here because as a community, there's some conversation about, well, we see rents going up, and we want to try to look at what we can do. And again, as I said, that respects the developer's rate of return, but helps to provide, housing for the people we're concerned about.
Could I just comment on that? Because
Yeah, then
it's not like we haven't added rental housing. We've built probably $100 million worth of rental properties in the last 5 years.
Yeah,
There's hundreds of units at Exit One. There's 100 and some odd units at Renaissance. There's somewhere less than 100 at Cotton Mill, and Brady Sullivan is building another 150 or 200.
right.
But the cost of those works out that those units are renting for 1,500 to 2,000 a month. And there's enough demand there to fill all of that.
Yeah.
And Flatley has never had a unit they built that didn't have somebody waiting to move into it. So it's just, there's a pent up demand in the mid-range there. And from what I understand about it, it's difficult at market rate financing to build something that is less than high-end rental.
And I think that's the equation that should be explored, because I think you're right. And again, as I said, there's been a lot of development. It's just, when you look at those numbers, there's just, with a low vacancy rate, it's almost a head scratcher. Like, you've put all these units online, and yet the vacancy is less than 1. And it may fluctuate a bit, but that's pretty low. And so it's sort of that data helps you look at it and say, we've done a lot of stuff. What is happening, and what are the economics of that sort of rental level that might make it really difficult to do.
Alderman Moriarty had a follow-up,
you.
and then Alderman Lopez.
So with all that said, I guess I should ask a question that's specific to why you're here, which is the workforce housing law. On this committee, we recently have addressed a couple types of legislation, ordinances for land use regarding elderly housing.
Mhm.
And so we were essentially making use of a state law that allowed us to give special privileges to, as far as density, to something that's targeted for usage. So So we can have land use laws that are fair to everybody, uniform to everybody, but we are allowed to give special favors towards to elderly housing. And then other people in the committee think, you know what, I think we should give special privileges to people who develop, young household. And this one's that's saying, is this law essentially giving the city of Nashua the ability to create land use codes that give special favors or special privileges to workforce housing?
Well, you always had that ability. What the law is trying to do is to call into attention that you need to be thinking about doing that, and because a lot of communities aren't doing that. And so there's a push towards very high-end housing such that, and we talk about gentrification of communities. And so and by the way, I'm not here to talk about the workforce housing law. I was asked to talk about housing and economic development for the workforce. And so
Okay.
the law is a good guidance because we don't know what that means. We don't want to talk about low-income folks or this and that. I think it's good to talk about it in terms of wages of the employers in not only your city, but in your region. And that's why we started out with that, to kind of tie it back to that, because that is, that is the reality of wages in the region. And again, not that it's just incumbent upon Nashua to solve that. There's a lot of communities around here where people can live and commute to. So that's just a just a piece of it all, I guess.
Alderman Lopez.
I was just going to observe, I guess, to the points already being made, that the list of employers and the types of jobs being discussed aren't particularly seasonal in nature, and they aren't as, workforce as I would imagine them. Like, you don't see 2CPAC on there, you don't see Hudson RPM, or even the really seasonal ones like Honey Baked Ham or Eileen Candles, where they may have surges of employees and they're looking for the workforce, the low income workforce, through certain periods of time, and they may pay them well. But then when they're done with their production order or the season's out for what they're trying to produce, they're not employing those people, on an ongoing basis. Another one is the retail sector, which probably individually none of these companies are as big as BAE, but collectively you could look at Simon Mall as an economic agent, and your workforce needs are very different at that point. That's where you do need more housing choice, and more density. I do think also, though, we should have a more intelligent approach to how we view density as a city. While I fully recognize Alderman Moriarty's point about free market and giving a developer the freedom to develop, certain constraints in some neighborhoods say you can't have a certain amount of density, whereas they don't necessarily say that in other neighborhoods. So a lot of the conversation we've been having this whole year, I feel like tracks back to looking at form-based code and saying, where do we want the taller buildings? Where do we want the denser workforce housing? Because we already have the infrastructure for it. So even for the builder and the developer, it makes more sense to put it there than somewhere where they're going to have to put more work into roads, sewers, and that kind of thing.
Alderman McCarthy. Oh, okay, I thought I saw your hand up. Any other thoughts, comments?
I think that's an interesting thing you mentioned about the age restricted housing, because I think one of the challenges when we talk about this is we might categorize this, and in the end, when I look at this, it's land use like, I live in a ranch in a neighborhood that's ever changing, but I have a retired neighbor across the street. I have a family with 3 kids, and then, I'm a single individual. And I find that, is it attractive enough? Is it, do we have a variety that this was an older house that could be affordable to my income? And in the end, we just try to look at not so, not what is workforce housing, but who, but in general, what are all of these compelling needs, and what do we as a community think about that in terms of how it may influence our local land use regulations? And that's meant to be the most heartfelt thing of even I and in the ZBA, and looking at my city of Dover, is, what do we do, and how do we balance all the needs we have with the reality that if we want to take care of our old folks as they retire, we want to be able to refresh a workforce, And that workforce is very varied, not just those that are there, but right, the lodging and retail and everything else. And so it's something to think about, and it's hard to solve, but it helps in provide the context when you look at impacts of land use regulations. And it may not be so much here in this community, but often in land use regulations, they don't look at the cost for the developer either, and often that it makes it tough. So we drive some of that because developers may know that it's going to be approved quickly and they'll be able to do it. And so there's a lot of nuance that goes with that I'm trying to sort of put forth that is part of the larger conversation around just providing a range of housing options, whether you call it workforce or age restricted. And that's sometimes we have an aging population, but I don't think the solution would be age restricted. To be what are people's needs and wants. We talk about folks that are millennials and what they're looking for, older folks, and some of them are competing for the same kind of housing. And it's always good to know that as we try to look at our land use regulations in our community and trying to balance all of that, which is complex.
And I think, we've been talking about rental for the most part, but I think on the workforce ownership side of housing, I live in South Nashua. We have all those apartments that Flatley put in. When they were built, there were like no children there. And I was up there the other day and 15 children got off a bus. And the conversation in my neighborhood, where we do have a healthy mix still, when you look at the enrollment in our local elementary school, we have a healthy mix of families with children. And those of us whose children are off doing their own thing in the world. So we're looking at, okay, we'd like to maybe sell our house, and we've got these families right over the hill in apartments who are looking at our neighborhoods. And for those people who want to stay in Nashua, where do they buy if they don't want to be in an age-restricted community? And I've had people say to me, is there anything downtown to buy? Because what we're looking at is rental property being developed, not condos or townhomes, something with a higher density downtown. So for me, that's another piece of what we're doing, because there are certainly homes in my neighborhood that would fit your definition of affordability and workforce housing, but people are just kind of sitting on them because they can't find something else that many people are still working and working in the area, so they don't want to increase their transportation costs. They like having access to everything that's here in the city of Nashua. So for them, if they could live closer to the downtown area, although it's often thought of as what millennials want, to your point, it's also what lots of people want.
Right. Right.
That I can maybe drive to work, take a bus to work, use a zip card to get where I need to be, whatever, and then come home and be able to live and shop right outside my front door. So I think, that's another thing that's recently come into the conversation. There's really not a lot available in terms of buying something in that kind of higher density situation.
Right. And I think it's an interesting point that you make, and I don't know what, again, it goes back to a developer, what maybe is driving that they want to keep that rental or not, so it's hard to know what may help incent that to happen or not. But getting back to the point, you want to have that conversation with them to let you know what it is you're really looking for as a community. And sometimes that's a helpful conversation to have, from at least anecdotally from what I've understood. So such that maybe that could be built. But that's an interesting observation, and you're talking about a different housing option type that might meet a need for a number of people.
Any other comments? Jim or James, do you want to join us? Or I saw you come in and you waved, and so I assumed you wanted to get my attention. Do you want to just comment during public comment and wait, or would you like?
I can make a comment during public comment, then it makes sense formally. Yeah.
We've got one piece of legislation, so Do you want to wait around for?
Sure.
Okay, okay. Anything else? Any other final thoughts? Well, thank you,
Thank you very much for the
for the
opportunity.
information and something to think about. And again, I just think it's important to think about workforce as there are people who are coming into our community kind of out of college or out of technical programs. They do have loans, and 10 years from now, they may have masters or PhDs and being able to afford $300,000 and $400,000 homes. But right now, because of situations and trying to contain their costs, they want to live close to work. And what that means for what we're doing in terms of housing. And I just think, as you and I talked about, we have the added factor of living so close to the border that some of the housing costs creeps into our community.
Right. Okay.
So it does kind of skew, I think, the perspective of what we can charge for rent because we're so close to the border also, and have people commuting, as those of us who go down Route 3 in the morning know. So thank you very much. Communications, we have none. Unfinished business, none. New business, none. Do I have a motion? Alderman McCarthy.
I'll move to take 01739 from the table.
Okay, you've all heard the motion to take 017039 from the table. And for those who may have forgotten, this is amending the zoning map by expanding the historic overlay district by adding Greeley Park to that district. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, that motion carries. So this ordinance was assigned to the planning board, received a favorable recommendation on June 1, 2016, and we then tabled it June 20th, 2017. Do I have a motion? Alderman McCarthy?
I will move to amend in its entirety with the proposed amendments that were placed on our desks this evening, and I'd like to speak to that.
Okay, so, please.
When we held it, I had suggested that what we really wanted to do was to make sure that the historic district was involved in an advisory role. I wrote some amendments and sent them to legal, which we've talked about a couple of times, but hadn't come back to the committee. Alderman Shoneman had expressed concern that the amendment that I had written simply dealt with buildings. So Attorney Clark had actually put the language back in that goes to anything that would have been under the purview of the historic district for an advisory opinion, and I'm fine with that. So I think the way this is probably what we want to do.
Okay, so you've heard the motion to amend 017039 in its entirety by replacing it with the amended version that was placed on your desk this evening. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Alderman McCarthy, do you have another motion?
You want
For
to count?
final
You want to count
passage?
the nays if there are any?
Are
I
there any
wasn't naying, I
nays?
just was a little slow.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I heard you say aye. I'm sorry.
I was thinking it really loud.
Oh, okay.
If the
So,
amendment passed, I'll make a
passed, yeah.
motion to recommend final passage as amended.
Okay, so discussion on that motion.
Madam Chairman.
Alderman Shoneman, please.
Thank you very much. I'm not on the committee, so I haven't been voting thus far. I plan to support this when it gets to the full board. I think that it does accomplish exactly what I think the Historic District was looking for. Those folks aren't here tonight, the folks from the commission, but all the conversations that I had with them, I think are embodied in this. I think they were looking for an advisory role, wanting to bring some expertise, wanting to help use that expertise to guide whatever happens in Greeley Park in the future on an advisory basis. And where Attorney Clark made the changes that Alderman McCarthy outlined, I think that we've accomplished that. And although they have not seen this yet, I expect, based on my conversations with them, that this will be fully supported by Historic District Commission.
Okay, thank you. And for those who are watching and wondering why Alderman Shoneman is here speaking to this, he's the liaison to the Historic District Commission.
Liaison to the
So,
Historic
yes,
District,
so,
that's correct.
um,
And the sponsor of this
And,
legislation.
and the sponsor, yes. Any other comments? Alderman Lopez, any? No? Alderman Moriarty?
I'm just noticing that the portion of Greeley Park bordered by Manchester Street to the Boston and Maine Railroad, so what does that not leave? There's a small section between the river and Boston and Maine that
Yeah.
is
Yes.
technically called Greeley Park.
Alderman Shoneman, would you like to speak?
There is a section of Greeley Park back there, and there was talk, about maybe developing a boathouse or some point somewhere down the line. But I think in as much as it's not kind of facing or fronting on Concord Street, which is really the border, if you look south from there, that's where the Historic District Commission has its purview. So it just seemed like a logical place to set the border. But yeah, something could happen across the railroad tracks between there and the river. A boathouse someday would be kind of nice. That wouldn't be wouldn't be subject to an advisory review by the Historic District Commission, but that's why.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, so the motion is to recommend final passage as amended. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And that motion carries.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other discussion? Public comment. Again, if you just state your name and address, please, for the record.
James Veo, 32 Spalding Street here in Nashua, New Hampshire. Also the downtown specialist here for the city of Nashua. I want to express my apologies. I missed the presentation. I was very eager to be here and attend and watch what George had to say. I regularly follow the housing market updates that are provided by the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. They really do, over time, show a trajectory of our market and is very useful data. And so thank you to NIFA and thank you, George, for everything you do and the time you took out to be here in Nashua today to share a little bit about our market.
My pleasure, thanks.
I even though I missed the presentation, due to another meeting I was at, I did catch some pretty interesting discussion, and I just wanted to provide a few points of interest to the committee that they may find useful as they move ahead with other actions in the future. The first of those was just to introduce a little bit of jargon relative to developers that impacts how development takes place in certain municipalities, and that is barriers to entry or threshold to entry. And so a lot of times a developer comes in and they're weighing their options and the risk associated with developing in a specific community, and they have a line right in their quick pro formas where they're assessing the barriers or threshold to entry. And that's literally all the costs associated with permitting, approvals, public messaging campaigns that would be required to get a development off the ground. And that is inversely proportional to the willingness and clarity in which the municipality lays out opportunities for development. So the more clear opportunities for development become and the less risk associated with proposing a project to be developed within that framework, the lower the threshold to entry is. The more convoluted the rules are and the more pushback you get from community members about not wanting a certain type of development in someone's backyard, the higher that risk for threshold to entry is. And this is really important because developers put very little of the total overall capital that's required into a project. And so small changes in the total capital cost of a development project have significant impacts on the risk and likelihood of the developer will pursue a project in a given municipality. For example, a project that might cost $40 to $30 million might require somewhere between $1 and $4 million in capital from a developer. And so you start to see the percentage of debt to capital investment by a developer in how those things can really come out of proportion. Could be as much as 40 to 1, 30 to 1. Every dollar the developer is spending, they're getting $30 of leveraging other cash. And so if they all of a sudden have $100,000 expense associated with land approvals that they weren't anticipating, it might literally bankrupt their project before they can get off the ground. And so they have to take that into account before they approach and embark on a development endeavor. So those non-metrics, they don't show up after everything's said and done. They're things that developers really have to take into account before they even embark on a project. The second component I want to bring up, Alderman Lopez had mentioned the zoning for the city. And one component of that zoning that is of particular striking interest to me from the analysis that I've done over my months here at the city of Nashua is the overall allowable density, in particular in the RC zoning districts. RC zoning district allows 12 and a half units per acre. In my analysis of the existing fabric of the downtown area, that's housing stock that's been around for decades in the downtown, is that it's about 22 units per acre. So if somebody wanted to take, say, a building that burned down, sat vacant for a year, and no longer qualified to be redeveloped under the previous use and need to come back before the planning board for approvals, they can only develop half the units that were previously allowed on that site. So what happens is over time, you have a dwindling down of the density and the intensity of pedestrians or residents that live in a given community because we've literally ordinanced out the density out of the community. This would have been less of an issue 100 years ago because there were larger families, people living 5, 6, 8, sometimes 12 residents to a household, and they had bigger houses. As time went on, people have smaller and smaller families. And correct me if I'm wrong, George, but I think the average household size is somewhere around 1.5 now, maybe 2. And so you have the same number of allowable units, you have smaller family sizes, that effectively reduces the total density of your neighborhood. It means people get pushed out of the neighborhood. It means there's disinvestment because your ordinance literally says you cannot build more density into that community that's already denser than the existing zoning. And so as the community or the city moves forward with comprehensive review of their zoning ordinance, it will be a difficult discussion, but it's one I encourage the aldermen to take, which is to look at the existing fabric, look at the existing densities, and make sure that you build in inherent opportunities for new developments to take place that match the existing densities so that the fabric of the neighborhood can be maintained in an order that retains the character of the neighborhood. So I know that was long-winded, and thank you for your time, and that's my comment.
Thank you. Okay. Remarks by Alderman. Alderman Moriarty, Alderman Lopez.
And following on what Mr. Veo said, and sort of what I was asking earlier, in general, I'm sort of curious to see what the density restrictions and zoning laws are, and sort of within 4 or 5 blocks of Main Street, and if there's any way we can change them so that it's not a drastic difference. Actually, across the whole city, for that matter. I don't want to. I'm not proposing coming into a neighborhood and doubling density, but just 10% increase across the board could make a big difference in the city. If it's currently 10, then maybe we should make it so that 15 is, so that over time it slowly builds into a city that makes sense.
Alderman Lopez.
Yeah, I agree with Alderman Moriarty. That's partly why I'm such a fan of the idea of form-based code, because it does that, but it also creates a structure that's logical, building out from the center and creating a density that's somewhat predictable. In addition to that comment, I also just want to remind everybody who's watching that the opioid awareness walk is this Saturday at 11 at Greeley Park.
Thank you. Alderman McCarthy.
Yeah, I actually think we do need to do it in a form-based way. I've actually looked at the properties and the densities within 4 or 5 blocks of Main Street, and I would not recommend we change, for example, a height restriction on Main Street itself, because there's a character to it, and for about a block on either side, it's basically 4 or 5 stories. There are properties to the east and west of those limits, however, that are underutilized industrial and commercial properties at the moment. For example, the School Street lot that we're looking at an RFP for, and the warehouse area to the west of that, and where the shoe factory was on, to the east, et cetera, where you could actually easily incorporate larger buildings. It's not quite that simple. The reason a lot of the stuff is 4 to 5 stories is because it's an entirely different plateau of investment once you go past there and go to steel frame construction. So if you're gonna allow that, you gotta allow, say, 10 or 12 stories to make that reasonable. But I think there are places we could do that without making dramatic change to the character of the neighborhoods around them, or at least the residential neighborhoods around them. So I think those are things we need to look at. I actually had distributed an example of the area from Pine Street over to, I think it was Spruce, and what the form-based code would essentially look like for those. So
And I would just follow up on that to say that it is one of the things that has been discussed by both Alderman McCarthy and myself with Director Marchant. And again, it's just a matter of finding the resources, one of them being time, to really put something together and build off of what Alderman McCarthy did to bring to us. But I think everyone who's been in that conversation, including Mr. Veos, been looking at that and looking at that as something we need in the city. Any other comments? I just have two announcements also. Thursday night at the library, the Telegraph League of Women Voters and the Public Library are having their next candidate forum, which is for Alderman at Large, and it is at 6:30 p.m. and it will also be televised on Channel 99. And then the other thing that is going on the same evening is the Governor's Advisory Commission on Intermodal Transportation is having a opportunity for people to comment on the 10-year plan. And that is happening at 7 p.m. over at Nashua Community College in room 150. And I believe I sent something to all of the aldermen because there are a number of proposed projects in there. One of them is looking at walkability, pedestrian safety on DW Highway. There are several for different street projects, and the airport has a project that's being discussed. So originally, the closest opportunities to comment were in Merrimack, which has already occurred in Peterborough, and they added some hearings. So this is bringing one closer to home. So it's another option for Thursday night if you would like to come and speak to the projects and congestion within the Nashua area. So if there is nothing else, there's no need for a non-public. Do I have a motion? Alderman Lopez?
Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, and we are adjourned at 8:18. Thank you all, and George, thank you again for joining us this evening. I'm glad you were able to
James, I have
make
an
it.
extra presentation if you need it.